Hello, I'm Layla and today I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research about rhythmic buildings, and in this case, particularly for transplanetary habitats. So I'm a third-year PhD researcher at the HBBE, and my background is in architectural technology. And what I'm trying to do is merge different fields and looking into finding explorative methods for interdisciplinary research. And to do so, I use my project called Alive Rhythmic Buildings. I can see that my slides are not exactly how I had them, but let's continue with the outline of the presentation, where first I'm going to talk to you about the challenges in transplanetary architecture. Then I'm going to move on to my rhythmic buildings vision, and then the toolbox I developed to enable the rhythmic buildings vision. And then I want to talk to you about some case study on how I test the toolbox, and finally conclude with some thoughts as well. So I want to start with some challenges in architecture. So there has been challenges that we face when we live in certain habitats, and those challenges are reflected in the architectural principles and the use of specific materials throughout time, but also throughout each geographical space. So if you can see here on the left side, we've got an igloo where people are trying to keep warm. So they really develop this insulative local materials to keep themselves warm. Well, on the opposite side, on the right, you can see this wind tower in Dubai, where they're trying to catch the wind to let the air flow throughout the building and to keep cool during the really hot summer month. So you can see this really ingenious architectural solutions and movements, which are actually still in use today. So these vernacular examples are using local material, and this is what led to adaptable and particularly bioclimatic architecture, which are principles that we still use today. And while we move to new destinations, we've got new challenges that come for that as well. While we go into space or other planetary bodies, we face different challenges geographically and throughout time as well. However, even on Earth, we face new challenges as well. While now we have our biodiversity being gradually destroyed, we've got climate change issues and resource depletions as well. So how do we tackle all of these new challenges of going into space, but also new challenges that we are facing here on Earth? I think we've heard a lot about IPCC yesterday as well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they suggest two approaches: it's mitigation of climate change, but also adaptation. And for my research, I looked into adaptation, which is the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or also expected stimuli or their effects, and which moderates harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. And I really want to put an emphasis on the actual, but also the expected stimuli or their effects. And so we've seen challenges more specific. So if we go to building on Mars, and this is something that I looked for in my master thesis, and we know about this from yesterday's session, but we're dealing with extreme temperature fluctuations, with harmful radiation, dust-containing perchlorate, which might be a good thing if we look at Paul James's interpretation of it, but it's still something we need to deal with. And obviously we have the transportation and the need to use ISRU. And the more we understand and the more we learn, the more challenges emerge as well. So for example, when I was doing my graduation project, I did not know if I needed to factor in Marsquakes because we didn't know if there was, we didn't have the data yet. And then they put the lander, and then we got actual measurements about that. And I could factor that in my structural engineering, which is what I know. But the more we understand, the more we learn, the more challenges emerge, but also we cannot know what the challenges in the future will be. But also we have opportunities. So we can reinvent life in space. And Jean-François Clairvaux said at IAC last year during this space sustainability session, we should use the environmental aspects as a resource rather than a constraint. So when we move to space, for example, we deal with microgravity, which is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity. How can we live in microgravity? How can we reinvent life in microgravity? And that works for Earth as well, how we deal with an increasingly difficult climate and increasing crisis such as pandemic, how could that challenge and change our way of lives, and in particular in the built environment? So my suggestion for that is rhythmic buildings. And rhythmic buildings is a theoretical adaptability strategy, which means to really adapt truly to the context. And by that, I mean the whole context. So really having this response between the context and the built environment, but also the people inside it. But how do you map such a context? How big is it? That's what I tried to do in my research. And I came up with a contextual framework, which is to which changes should building adapt to. And I follow the 3 pillars of sustainability: show the response to the environment, response to society, and response to economy. And as you can see, we've got them divided into contextual aspect as well. So we've got the microclimate, the urban climate, the local climate, and climate change for the environmental aspects. But then when we move to society, we have things like comfort, physiology, psychology, and behavior, and these all affect the built environment in one way or the other. And then economical aspect, I found industrial ecology aspect. Economy, function, and schedule also affect the built environment. And then I dug a little bit deeper and in more detail, and then found out all these parameters that are actually really guiding changes in the built environment. So for example, if we look at local climates on the top right, you can see daylight, humidity, and temperature, which are really classic examples. And the vernacular examples I showed you in the first place, they were really dealing with temperature change. So being really cold in the igloo or too hot in Dubai. And they're dealing with airflow as well. So they're using the airflow and the wind on the location to cool down the building inside. And so there's different adaptability strategies, and I mapped a few of them. The vernacular examples I was showing you are looking more into physiology and comfort. They're really trying to enable comfort for the inhabitants. While bioclimatic architecture I've mentioned earlier is really looking into responding to the climatic aspect of the environment. And then you've got some strategies that really sit in between those two. So you've got adaptive comfort, for example, that really tries to create great comfort indoors, but also adapt to things like energy efficiency. And I looked at a few strategies and mapped all of them. But as you can see, they're all sitting tightly in their own corner. And we do have a lot between societal and environmental, but we do not have economy. And what we know about sustainability is that you need to address all 3 pillars of sustainability if you want to have a truly sustainable solution. So what I try to do is I sit in the middle with what I call rhythmic buildings. But why rhythmic? Because all of these parameters have rhythms. They all change over time and they all have different rhythms. So I map those rhythms at different frequency. So you've got hourly rhythms and daily rhythms. And for example, daylight has a really strong daily rhythm on Earth. So throughout the day, we've got daylight, throughout the night, we don't. But when we move off planet, that might change. On Mars, it's the same. But if you go to ISS, then your daylight rhythm actually moves more to the hourly one because it changes faster. Seasonally, you can see in Newcastle, we've got a temperate climate and the temperature drops are quite different between winter and summer. But when you move to the tropics on Earth, then your seasonal temperature rhythms are more flat. And if you look at weekly, the schedule that the users are having inside the building also affects the building. If it's only in use throughout the week and not in the weekend because it's an office, that also affects how the building should behave. But this is very theoretical. So how do I make rhythmic buildings happen? I devised a toolbox, and this is still work in progress. And you can see I've got analysis tool, design tools, and technological tools. The framework you've already seen. The skill tool I won't highlight today. I will move more into the design tools and technological tools. So the design tools, I looked into methods emerging from functionalism. So here you can see from Markstam and Fletcher how they, in the 60s already, mapped different schedules of users inside. And then they try to map those schedules with different functions in the building in the bubble diagram you see at the bottom. And then that makes the step where you can start drawing up plans and really going to the architectural scale. And this is also used in space architecture. So here's a method by Sandra Halplik-Moisborger, where she tries to map different functions depending on sleep, food, hygiene, leisure, work, but also EVA, extravehicular activities, and mechanical workshop, and how these relate to each other. Are they spatially separated or are they function overlapping? And this is, for example, the ISS and how that looks like. So you can see the sleep quarter is separated and hygiene as well. But for example, leisure and work kind of overlaps in function. And then my technological tool is a materials database. I'm trying to find materials that are adaptive and responsive. Here you can see an example of a researcher from the Hub, Emily Birch, and her bacterial spores, which are responding to humidity stimuli. So I'm mapping standard properties such as mechanical and chemical properties that we know and we need to know if we want to build with those materials. But also I try to map their rhythm over time. To what stimuli do they react? And so to test those tools, I did 2 case studies. This is very much work in process. I'm working on this right now. So I've got a tiny house where I analyze the seasonal rhythms in Northumberland. And then I've got a Martian habitat where I analyze the daily emission rhythm for a 2-year mission at Jezero crater. I'm letting you guess which one I'm going to highlight today. It's the Martian Hab. So what I did is I started by analyzing the context. So I looked at different environmental aspects, also crew emission aspects. And you can see that daylight has a really strong daily rhythm. It's kind of similar on Mars as it is on Earth. Temperature has really, really strong daily fluctuations. But also you have toxicity. You've got to deal with radiation that also has a rhythm of solar particle events. So if you see a Jezero crater, you've got -20 degrees throughout the day and -80 degrees Celsius throughout the night, which is really strong temperature fluctuation. And then you can also see the pressure on the right and the H2O, which is resources that we might use and how those fluctuate throughout the day as well. And then looking at the bottom of the context analysis, you can see MET and clothing. MET is metabolism, so it's related to your activities and schedule. And I looked at those in a longer rhythm and in a daily rhythm. So daily rhythm would be the activities of the crew. So you can have 4 crew members that alternate their activities so that the workday is longer and you can experiment and work more while you're on this mission, but while still allowing everyone to have enough rest and leisure and sports. But this alternating function needs to be reflected in the habitat as well if we want to be efficient. But if we look at the mission timeline, when the crew lander arrives, when the habitat's being built, but when the crew is using it, you can see that it's much wider, but at the bottom, the orange bit of crew 2, you can see there's another crew arriving later on. But that could be that the mission ends as well. So you would need the building at a certain amount of time, and then you wouldn't need it when the astronauts come back to Earth. So in designing the Hab, I looked at this design tools from Sandra Helblich-Moisberger, but I also added an extra function is when the spaces are spatially and visually closed off, but they need to be technically connected. This emerged from the tiny house case study as vital into designing further with this tool. And so if I map this for this case study, we've got a day where we've got a lot of work, leisure, and cook functions. And at night, we've got more of a sleep and hygiene functions. And you can overlay them. And that's when you start thinking, how am I going to make this technology ready when I have functions that change throughout the day? But also they need to change on a longer timeline as well, where the first year the building needs to be built. In year 2 until year 4-ish, they need to be in use. And after that, you don't want to have a building on Mars anymore because you don't want to leave too much behind. And also you need to deal with those daily rhythms while the habitat is in use as well. So it's a lot of complexities. And for that, we need new technologies and new materials. So I'm working on this materials database using a point-based system to map responsive technologies and materials. And hopefully that will look something like that, where you would have, oh, material 1 is actually not that great, while material 3 has really good properties on that side of it. And still working on it, bear with me. But for example, for Mars, local resources, we've got regolith, and then we've got ice underneath the surface. And we could create polyethylene from the atmosphere as well. And then we could look at, for example, ice, because it's translucent, so it allowed daylights inside, so responding to daylight rhythm and circadian rhythm of the crew. Well, it's also being reinforced by thawing and freezing cycle, actually having almost self-healing properties. So really using the environment to the advantage of the structural elements. But it also slowly sublimates at the end of the mission, which means that after these 4 years, the habitat could sublimate back into the atmosphere and you wouldn't leave a trace behind. I looked into that for my master's as well, and this is a exhibition I did in the Kunsthal in Amersfoort, where this was an ice igloo for Mars, Jezero crater. But I also want to highlight that ice also has limitations. Ice needs to be mined on site, which requires high amounts of energy to process, especially lifting and melting requires an enormous amount of energy. You can use phase change to reduce this energy, but you still need a lot of robotics and things to do that all remotely. And also we're kind of unsure what the crystallization on Mars is. It's already really difficult on Earth. There's so many different crystals affecting the properties as a material. So what I think is going to be the next thing, being with the hub for biotechnology in the built environment, is going beyond and using biotechnology. You can see our hub is actually working on multiple scales, where we're looking at mycelium, and you've seen monocast columns that are yay big. And then we've got bacterial cellulose using potentially as a facade element you see in the middle, which is also a prototype we're working on. And I hope to take you to the hub after this session, so you can see it in real life and touch it and smell it. You can smell it for sure. And then you can go down the scale, and we work with algae and with bacterial spores, like I showed you from Emily. And these elements are incredibly responsive. They respond to different rhythm. They have a circadian rhythm, and they're way more responsive than our more traditional materials. So what I want to conclude my talk with is some thoughts. That adaptability is vital on Earth, we know that, and especially the more extreme our environment is becoming. But adaptability to the whole context presents opportunities to be intrinsically rhythmic and therefore sustainable. And if we merge that with reinventing life in space, and maybe also here on Earth, then rhythmic buildings is an explorative method for transplanetary habitats that can guide innovative design and really be a vision to implement biotechnology. And I want to leave with, the more extreme the context, the more relevant adaptation or rhythmic buildings. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has questions. Yes, I think we need to use the mic. Are you happy? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So there is a fundamental idea that is behind the rhythmic buildings that you are commenting on. Once we use the buildings, then they kind of disappear, right? So how do you envision that we are going to end our materialistic way of thinking, and we are going to apply also that on Earth? We're going to start building cities, and then they will, vanish.
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't mentioned it in that much detail, but this is very much long-term vision. We've got a lot of visions for more shorter terms, think 20, 30 years, with our goals for 2050 and 2060. But this is really looking into further out and related back to the scenarios we were talking about, the most improbable one. It is to guide you, but I'm thinking and seeing rhythmic buildings as building that intrinsically adapt and also evolve. So for example, buildings in a city would adapt and change to different needs. Hopefully not, but if we go through another pandemic, our buildings will then adapt and change completely. And then you want to have buildings that are all different as well, because one has a household of 2 people working a lot, and then one has a household of 8 people that are home a lot. And those buildings will change and adapt to the people inside it as well. So you will get this architecture that really doesn't need the architect that much anymore, but really guides to the most efficient way and the most comfortable way, both for the outdoor environment and the indoor residents. And yeah, I don't know, I should probably try to visualize that more in a video or something, because it is in my mind, but it's not tactile yet, because we haven't developed the technology yet. We haven't developed all the things yet. But as we are developing very innovative technologies, we're looking into engineering living materials, which the possibilities are infinite. But we need to make that happen in order for us also to visualize how it could happen. And this vision is trying to guide you to showing you all the possibilities and where you could go with your research. Hope that answers the question. And if anyone has another online, yeah.
We have two questions online. The first one is, what kind of rhythmic alignments will living material have? Should I read the second one? Or?
We're getting all our steps in today. Rhythmic alignments, yes. So the rhythms have different frequency and different speed. So you need to map those as well. So the frequency I have now daily, hourly, and seasonally, but you can be way more precise. So you need to align that. For example, the spores react to humidity in a few minutes, like 4 or 5 minutes, which is great if you have high humidity in a room. For example, if you're taking a shower, then you augment the humidity in that really small room really fast, and you need to deal with that really fast. The spore could use that. But you've got some rhythm that are completely misaligned. And that's where I think, and I hope, our biotechnologists and synthetic biologists can help us with that. But definitely needs more research into finding out how to map and connect those, which I'm trying to do with the database, but hopefully tell you more next time.
What are the key enabling technologies for the living construction?
That's a really good question. Well, I've mentioned Emily's spores a lot. Well, it's not hers, but she's working on it in the hub, and she's the spores queen in the hub. I think this is where I would want to take it, because it has, it's cyclical, so they can change and they can adapt really quickly, and they can do so multiple cycles. But there's different ways of responding, such as mycelium, for example, can help us create a network where it kind of communicates in a way with different elements. So they could be connectors. And I think if you want to know more about that, you really should look at the whole breadth of work we're doing at HBBE. I'm trying to provide a bit of a vision and an idea and tools to design and bridge that and scale that up to the built environment. But really, the other people and researchers working with us are the stars finding out what biotechnologies will be enabled.
I think we have time for one more question. And is there any one here? Or yeah, there is one on chat.
Are there any trade-off between rhythmic synchronization and other properties?
Yes, of course. There are, and there's different changes that building can adapt to. There's unexpected changes, things that are man-made or natural disasters, so earthquakes or war. And these are very sudden changes, and rhythmic buildings won't help you with that, because we can't expect those because they're unexpected, such as pandemic. And definitely when you adapt to everything, you don't know where it's going, and especially pointing back to what Angelo said about allowing the biotechnologies and the organisms to do their thing and to have a bit of chaos and really come together and see what comes out of it. That could also be rhythmic buildings, but maybe, I don't know, far future, those technologies will take over and we're like, actually, the humans are really not efficient in our habitat. We can chuck them out. So there are trade-offs, and right now I can't think of a very specific one because I'm a very unspecific research and very broad. And I hope I'm answering the question, but we don't know a lot of things yet. Voila.
It's more of a comment, I guess. Sorry. So I think there are these so-called purple swan events, which are predictable or predicted, like the pandemic was actually predicted, and many other ecosocial happenings like the war can also be predicted. So I think what we need is we need to collaborate with speculative futures thinkers. And I know that the EU government also works with some experts in that field. So I think we need to bring someone to the hub as well to help us predict how our buildings will change, move, and their environments maybe.
Yes, black swan scenarios are actually known as you need to plan for scenarios you don't know that's going to happen, because the first rule of scenario planning is that your scenario won't happen. But it does help to plan these scenarios, and you need to plan scenarios for short term where they're more well known and less going AWOL, and then more long-term scenarios where they're very much unspecific, but it does enable you to think of how could scenarios more specific and more closer to us arrive. And yeah, I agree. We should look into scenario planning. I'm very much for that. I think we're going to leave it at this. I don't want to hoard the whole presentation because actually got a great session coming up. So it's my pleasure to have the Sustainable Habitats and Travel session. And our first speaker is Amy Holt. She's she did this research at International Space University, and her presentation is Development of a Sustainable Off-World Habitat Utilizing a Bioarchitectural Approach. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you for inviting me along today, to the organizers. And yeah, I'm going to talk a bit today about work that I conducted as part of my master's degree last year at the International Space University. It was on the development of a sustainable off-world habitat utilizing a bioarchitectural approach. So this was done as part of an individual research project. So just briefly to go through what we'll talk about, I'll give you a brief introduction, talk a bit about bioinspiration and design, some properties that might be required in future materials. And then I'll talk a bit more in detail about a proposed biodesign approach that I developed as part of this project and its application to the theoretical construction of a lunar habitat.
So sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
We'll just move this down because we want everyone to see your whole presentation.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thanks. And then I'll briefly talk about evaluating the process and finish off with some recommendations and conclusions for future work. Now I can't skip it. Hang on. There we go. So many space agencies, along with various public and private entities, are looking into developing lunar settlements. Especially with NASA's Artemis missions and the proposed return to the moon basically this decade. So it's worth looking at what current architectural practices are like here on Earth. Obviously, we know that many of them are quite unsustainable. So moving to off-world construction will require embracing some alternative methods. Specifically, we should try to incorporate sustainability into the facet of design. So what is bioinspiration in design and how does that relate to sustainability? So the use of biomaterials would be one example of bioinspiration in design. These are materials which are grown as opposed to those that are manufactured, is the definition that I use for my research. As I mentioned, man-made materials such as concrete and steel are not sustainable and are not so easily disposed of at the end of their lives. So this has seen emerging concepts of things like green buildings and sustainable architecture involving these biomaterials. As mentioned in many of the other talks over the last day or so, these include things like fungal mycelium, bacterial nanocellulose, plants, and even animal cells, which are used in regenerative medicine, bioengineering, for the construction of tissues and even organs using 3D bioprinting. Another example of bioinspiration in design is Oh, thank you. Another example of bioinspiration design is biomimicry. So this is, again, has been mentioned over the past day, taking inspiration from functional strategies already developed in the natural world. So natural biological organisms over millions of years through evolution have developed solutions to a variety of design problems. So it's taking these solutions that have already been developed and applying them to various processes, products, and systems that human beings require them for. So also a quick comparison of the difference between man-made engineered materials and biological materials. I won't go through all of them, but for example, engineered materials are not so responsive to their external environment and have a high level of redundancy in general, whereas biological materials have several good features, such as they're capable of self-repair and replication and are extremely responsive to their exterior environment. So what might we require in future materials, specifically for materials that might be required for developing construction of habitats off-world in space, like on the lunar surface? So these kind of materials have been proposed by people in the space industry, that they'll require new sort of high-level capabilities. Specifically, 3 functional features have been put forward as playing a key role in these systems. Again, these are self-restoration or self-healing, an increased ability of adaptability, and increased multifunctionality. As you'll notice, these are things that we just saw are also features of many biological materials. So this led me to the development of this biodesign approach, I suppose you could call it. So from a sustainability perspective, the inclusion of these bio-based ideas and systems is essential for developing new structures off-world. Therefore, this approach sort of involves combining these bio-based ideas and incorporating them into a kind of integrated design theory or process that could be used in the development of new products or even structures. It's a 4-stage approach and involves, I'll go through them a bit more in detail in the next slides, but it basically involves defining the design challenge, implementing a sort of biomimetic approach, identifying an appropriate biomaterial, and then finally conducting potentially bioengineering. So like I say, I'll go through those a bit more in detail over the next slides. Oh, skip forward. So to kind of illustrate this approach, I decided to apply it in a kind of case study to a theoretical construction of a lunar habitat. So step 1, defining the design challenge. This involves characterizing the local environment and taking note of any unique constraints or challenges presented by that environment. So for the lunar surface, this includes things like the fact, obviously it's quite different to on Earth, there's no breathable atmosphere, there's lower levels of gravity, there's increased ionizing radiation in the form of galactic cosmic rays and solar flares. There's no biological ecosystem, and the only water known to exist is frozen, mainly found at the lunar poles. So for the sake of this sort of walkthrough exercise or case study, I decided to focus on just one of these constraints, specifically the ionizing radiation, and therefore the sort of requirement for developing protection from that or shielding. So step 2, implementing a sort of biomimetic approach. As mentioned, this is kind of taking solutions that nature has already found for certain design problems. So in this, I kind of utilized this Biomimicry Institute's Ask Nature database, which currently sort of holds about over 1,700 strategies that nature has for solving complex problems. So by looking at how nature can protect itself from physical harm, specifically from non-living threats and nuclear radiation, which is as close as we get to kind of the radiation emitted in space through this database. It's identified 3 living organisms that had unique methods of doing this, basically. The tardigrade, the Deloid rotifers, and the bacterium Deinococcus radiodurans. So tardigrades are able to enter a state of dormancy called a tun, where they're able to protect themselves from certain extreme environmental conditions. The rotifers, in a different way, are particularly efficient at eliminating reactive oxygen species, which are damaging to DNA. And the radiodurans is again particularly efficient at repairing its proteins to minimize induced radiation damage. So these are 3 ways in nature has evolved ways to protect itself, which I'll mention in a bit of how that could be potentially implemented into a design approach. So the 3rd step in this kind of biodesign process is identifying an appropriate biomaterial. It might come as no surprise over the talks we've had over the last day or so that the material identified after doing quite an extensive literature review was the fungal mycelium, or indeed a biocomposite of that, would be best suited, I suppose, for taking forward for the construction of some sort of bio-based off-world habitat. This is because mycelium not only has several key properties that are favorable, such as being biodegradable and lightweight, but it can be crucially grown at destination, as other people have already mentioned. So that involves taking less upmass from Earth to destination. It can also, growing conditions can also be adapted to maximize its features. And indeed, there are already some species of fungi that, much like the bacteria I just mentioned, are already even resistant, have radio-resistant properties, or even utilize radiation as their energy source. So yeah, this was identified as the most appropriate biomaterial in this instance. Again, partly because a lot of research has already taken place on mycelium, and the technology readiness levels have probably slightly higher than some of the other materials in this case. So the final stage after identifying a material would be potentially to conduct bioengineering. So if after the previous steps have been carried out, the material still has certain intrinsic weaknesses, it could potentially be possible to optimize the material's properties through genetic engineering, basically, or through the use of synthetic biology. This could involve things like upregulating genes, or even introducing new genes into the fungal genome. So yeah, you could potentially isolate radiation-resistant genes and incorporate them into the genome. You could potentially utilize, like I say, a fungal species that already has radio-resistant properties, or you could potentially even try and incorporate some of the resistant species into the mycelium-based composite itself, or develop it into some form of outer coating. So in a sort of brief evaluation of this process, obviously, this is kind of a theoretical process in the hope of designing a system that would help people in their design process. So obviously, further research is still required. However, all the individual sort of elements of these processes are already being used within different fields. So it's not, I think, beyond the realms of possibility to incorporate this into one kind of strategy. The identification of the design problem and the biomimetic strategy were fairly straightforward, especially with the database of the Ask Nature database that the Biomimicry Institute already has in place. Involving the selection of the biomaterial, like I say, that mainly relied on a literature review. So I think stage 3 would definitely benefit from a more rigorous comparison tool, which Layla has kind of mentioned that she is also working on a sort of database of biomaterials and their properties. And I think stage 4 could also benefit from a similar kind of tool, helping people perhaps that are not biologists in nature to identify the most suitable molecular techniques that they could use in such a process. So this led on to future recommendations, which, like I say, involved the creation of a database of biomaterials and their properties to help people identify easily the most appropriate material for a particular task. This could maybe be potentially added to over time in a sort of community-driven fashion. Maybe a step on from that would be the proposal of creating a sort of biodesign app that incorporated these 4 steps and could kind of integrate the whole approach and help people to, like I say, utilize the resources in their sort of design endeavors. This doesn't necessarily have to be for like off-world habitats or structures. It could be to, for products potentially, or things on Earth even. And finally, I would recommend, unsurprisingly perhaps, incorporating a kind of interdisciplinary approach, which would help to cross-fertilization of ideas between the various fields that obviously overlap in this kind of area of like material science, biology, architecture, and systems design. Having regular biodesign conferences, much like this one, and the creation of a kind of online community or hub to help people in their collaborations. So finally, to conclude, yeah, it was kind of proposal of a novel biodesign process incorporating a 4-stage approach of identifying a design challenge, trying to implement biomimetic approach, identifying the most appropriate biomaterial, and potentially implementing some bioengineering. So I did a bit, like say, a sort of case study of identifying mycelium-based products for use in the lunar environment, and potentially the use of novel life forms like these microbial life forms that could, their properties of radiation resistance could potentially be utilized in the habitat construction. So I think with further work and the development of more comprehensive databases and the integration of these stages, and potentially, like I say, development of an app, this could hopefully help and assist in the development of future construction projects, both here on Earth and off-world. So I finally just finish off with a few acknowledgements to people at the university, my supervisor, Daniela Stupa, and my academic advisor, Professor Virginia Wotering, and obviously everyone here at the BioHub. And thank you very again for having me along to the symposium today to talk. So that's it. We'll take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Does anyone have? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So what is the interdependency between the biomimicry approach and the biomaterial selection? What I mean with that is, for example, if you choose some genetic mechanism that is building some sort of radiation, something to avoid harmful effects of the radiation, maybe you can apply that to some biomaterials, but maybe not to others. Maybe you can introduce that in mycelium, but not in bacteria. So what is the dependency?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. How are the kind of stages necessarily linked? So I suppose ultimately the idea was to try and incorporate as many elements that could be useful and sort of bio-inspired as well as potentially sustainable as possible. But I admit that perhaps in not every case, every step would be absolutely necessary. So it could be, for example, that for the sake of developing one, say, product or design, you might find that a biomimetic approach is not necessarily the most useful approach. So it could be that you utilize some steps or elements of the process or the design and not every single one of them. I perhaps should have made that clearer. I think optimally, it's the idea that these things are there and available for use. And like I say, that sort of collating the information and database is together gives people the option when they're trying to create or design something, the option to maybe pick from parts of the stages if they want to. Like I say, it might be a bit like I think Christine said yesterday, that not all the time these bio approaches are the best approach. So it's probably worth mentioning that I think it's good to see if they could be implemented, and it would involve an element of sustainability, hopefully, but there might indeed be times when they're not the best approach. I admit that. So sometimes I think you wouldn't perhaps be able to perhaps incorporate every single step of this process, but I think the idea is that they're there if to help optimize these bio-influenced approaches and sustainable aspects, if they can indeed be applicable to your work, if that answers it. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, I do have one. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. I think we've got some overlap here. Yes, I have a question, because you're looking at it at a theoretical design case study. And if it's theoretical, why would you bother with TRL? You said you were looking at mycelium because it has a higher TRL. But yeah, why bother if it's theoretical anyway?
Okay, so like, why bother with the idea of the kind of design sort of in the first place?
More of why are you looking exclusively at technologically more advanced materials?
I suppose that was to perhaps illustrate, like I say, when I came to that stage of identifying an appropriate biomaterial and obviously going through the literature and stuff and looking at the qualities of the materials and I mean, yeah, this is, I suppose, a summarization of a report that I wrote, which is kind of more in depth. So I was kind of, you know, creating tables and comparisons between different materials and their properties. And I guess when I started doing that, I began to realize that it was quite time consuming and there wasn't an easy or simple thing that already existed. Like I say, after already finding the kind of biomimicry based database, that's when it began to dawn on me, I suppose, that this could really do with being all this information being put together. So like I say, I suppose that stage in the identification of the mycelium was, yeah, it was slightly arbitrary in nature, I admit that. And I suppose when I say it's a slightly higher TRL, that's because, like I say, more research, it seemed to me the more I dug, that more research had been done on the sort of mycelium-based structures and stuff, like, I guess, like people mentioned yesterday, like Lynn Rothschild and NASA have specifically tried to raise the TRL of mycelium-based kind of building structures for the purpose of off-world construction. So there was that work that was already there that identified it, I suppose, as something that was kind of already further along the line that made it a potential use case. I don't think that means necessarily the other things should be dismissed. I think there's perhaps just less research that's already been conducted on them, unfortunately. I think definitely some of the other biomaterials with more research and stuff could potentially turn out that they might be just as applicable. But yeah, it like I say, I suppose the mycelium was perhaps the obvious choice. It was what had the most information available on it at the time, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. The more higher TRL, the more information, I guess. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on to our online presenter. Next one is Gökçe and Işık, who's going to present sustainable space missions and habitation with biomaterials and technology.
Okay, so I'm Gökçe, and today I will be talking about sustainable space missions and habitation with biomaterials and biotechnology. Excuse me, yeah. And I will be investigating this topic under three main questions, and it's a speculative future scenario of space mission and habitation. And the questions are: why is sustainability of space important? What are the problems to tackle about space sustainability? And how can we build a sustainable and circular system for space missions and habitations? And under those questions, I'll be mentioning about rocket emissions, space debris, sustainable space rating, rocket fuels, space materiality, algal biofuel, bioplastic, and mycelium composite. Sorry. Yeah. So first thing, why is sustainability of space important? With the development of technology and decreasing costs, the number of space missions and travels are increased, and they're going to keep increasing with a fast rate. And the increase of the space missions has some consequences, and those are increasing in rocket emissions, which deliver gases and particles directly into the middle and upper atmosphere. And secondly, space junk or space debris is any piece of machinery left by humans in space. Rocket emissions. Rocket launches can inject huge amounts of soot into higher layers of Earth's atmosphere, depending on their fuel, possibly contributing to climate change. And soot in the atmosphere can absorb heat and affect the temperature of the higher layers of atmosphere, the mesosphere, and the stratosphere. And Orbex said in its statement that 120 rocket launches emit as much soot as the entire global aviation industry emits in a year. And these numbers are really, we need to consider about them. And what about space junk? We are not just leaving some trace of gases and particles, we are really leaving some pieces and these are called space junk. And all space junk is a result of us launching objects from Earth, and it remains in orbit until it re-enters the atmosphere. Not only have we left a lot of space junk in Earth's orbit, there are objects elsewhere too, such as on the lunar surface. And things left on the moon since the beginning of lunar exploration: 3 moon buggies from Apollo, 54 uncrewed probes that have crashed or landed on the moon, 190,000 kilograms of material left by humans on the moon. And taking into consideration the space junk and rocket emissions, the Space Sustainability Rating was developed jointly by the World Economic Forum, the European Space Agency, and MIT Media Lab. As the challenge of orbital debris or space junk is set to grow, current and future missions face an increasing risk of possible collisions. The rating, designed to encourage sustainable behavior, will look at various aspects of the mission design, including the choice of orbit, measures to prevent collisions, and deorbiting plans. And also, companies will be able to gain bonus points for installing special features on their spacecraft that would make active removal easier at the end of their satellite's lifetime. And if we ask, what are the problems to tackle about space sustainability? Okay, there are rocket emissions, but which rocket fuels and what are their effects? And also we should look more deep into space materiality. So rocket fuels are highly toxic while they are using and also after the usage. So and they are explosive and they are actually ready to explode in any minute. So they need to be calculated very precise, like where should be the part will fall into Earth, because it's going to be toxic there. So it shouldn't be somewhere in humus settlement. And the risk of explosion should be calculated really specifically. And soot that I mentioned before causes climate change, and we use Earth resources to produce rocket fuels. And also in this production and usage process has carbon emissions. And what about space junk and materiality that I mentioned here, materials for mission and long short-term habitation? They also use the Earth resources. They are not degradable. Therefore, we have space junk and they are staying there for a long period of time. And it also has carbon emissions for the production. And about rocket fuels, rockets emit a variety of substances depending on their propellant. Some, like liquid hydrogen and oxygen, are very clean, emitting mainly water and some nitric oxide, which is produced by the heat of combustion. Others, like aluminum, ammonium perchlorate, release hydrochloric acid and alumina particles. And rockets that use hydrazine, which are the most used rocket fuel, and nitrogen tetroxide produce large quantities of nitrogen oxides, which can further react with water vapor and sulfate in the atmosphere to form small particles containing nitric acid, which cause acid rains also. And kerosene rockets, essentially aircraft fuel, produce CO2 and black carbon, that's soot, which are climate active gases, meaning that they absorb infrared or visible light, heating the surrounding air. And rocket soot accumulates in the upper stratosphere where the particles absorb sunlight. This accumulation heats the upper stratosphere, so changing chemical reaction rates and likely to leading to ozone loss. And titanium, aluminium, steel, and Kevlar are some of the most used materials for rockets. Space stations and short long-term habitation are made of Earth resources and generate carbon emissions via production, and they are not degradable at the end of their usage. So at the end of all those things, we should ask ourselves, how can we build a sustainable and circular system for space missions and habitations? The answer is simple, actually. Biology is the ultimate technology, And we should see space as a habitat rather than an endless void. Because if we see it as an endless void, then we don't take the responsibility of our actions. And this is what we are doing also on Earth. Like we are producing, we are using, and we don't think about the end life process. And it's a linear production process. So it leads us to leave some space junk or emissions also in the space, but it's also a habitat for us and for other species, a transplanetary habitat. So we should take the responsibility from now on. And this research studies the integration of biomaterials and biotechnological systems by examining the effects of space missions and the possible planetary settlement scenario. And the scenario suggests, firstly, the production of rocket fuels as algae biofuel on the inhabited planet. Secondly, the waste usage from algae biofuel production as a bioplastic mold for mycelium composite materials that to be used for growing building materials, and examine this process features. By using nature billions years old genius, mycelium, which is a vegetative part of the fungi, as a transformer, the waste generated in the mission and process can be transformed into building materials. So here I'm talking about circular system proposition. Rather than isolating and categorizing the needs, we can integrate the system inputs and outputs into a dynamic transplanetary circular system. And the system, it's a speculative mission from Earth to Mars, and it takes its algae biofuel from Earth. And when on Mars, the algae biofuel production is happening, and it's also research of Georgia Institute of Technology about producing algae biofuel on Martian surface. And the remaining algae biomass can be turned into bioplastic, which then turn into a bioplastic mold to be grow mycelium materials. And with algae biomass, also the other wastes that generates in the mission, like food, agriculture, or other kind of wastes can be turned into building composites with mycelium. And those composites can be used as bricks, panels, or isolation. And after that process, it's degrading there. So we don't actually leave any trace, and we are closing the loop. And the mission rocket can turn to the Earth again with the biofuel produced in the Mars. So it also, so we need half of the rocket fuel while coming to the Mars. So we are decreasing the weight, which is really important for missions. And we don't use toxic fuels in this process. And if you look more deep into that project also, researchers at the Georgia Institute of Technology have developed a concept that would make Martian rocket fuel on Mars that could be used to launch future astronauts back to Earth. The bioproduction process would use 3 resources native to the red planet: carbon dioxide, sunlight, and frozen water. It will also include transporting 2 microbes to Mars. The first would be cyanobacteria, is algae, which would take CO2 from the Martian atmosphere and use sunlight to create sugars. An engineered E. coli, which would be shipped from Earth, would convert those sugars into a Mars-specific propellant for rockets and other propulsion devices. And with those weights, we can produce bioplastic mold. Why bioplastic mold? Because less amount of plastic usage as mold for biomaterial production is replaced by algae bioplastic in this scenario to achieve in-situ production and also close the material loop. Algae biofuel waste turn into raw material for bioplastic molds, which are biodegradable, non-toxic, circular, and sustainable. And in this scenario, molds are used for mycelium material growth. And And mycelium composites, as you all know, I think mycelium, the vegetative root-like structure of fungi, has the ability to transform waste into solid material with the desired properties in 1 or 2 weeks. Together with algae biomass and other waste generated during the mission and habitation, are the substrate to grow mycelium composite materials to be used as bricks, panels, foam, fillings, insulation, because mycelium is the nature's glue and it has the property to hold things and become solid materials. And here the source is waste, and it turns into building or insulation material that could be used in habitation or technical material for spacecraft. And substrates can be algae biofuel waste or Martian soil or other solid wastes. And why mycelium composites? Because the properties are really suitable for transplanetary habitation. It's UV resistant, acoustic insulation, thermal insulation. It's the degradable, biodegradable, lightweight, in-situ production, zero waste, fast growth, fire resistant, and optimizable according to the performance and geometry need, like flexibility, strength, shape, building, texture, and building method. Like we can use different methods like brick or 3D printing or more like monolithic structures. So it depends also on the design, and we can achieve in a really range, this range of scale is really wide. The increase in interplanetary discoveries with the developing technology has also increased the number of space missions, satellites, and naturally consumed Earth resources and space junk. Nowadays, one of the most important focuses is what needs to be done for a sustainable future for our world and for transplanetary life. This study shows the possibility of sustainable and effective features, transplanetary habitation, and missions by integrating the biotechnologies we have into efficient and well-designed circular systems, rather than reflecting a system in which we consume the world's resources irresponsibly to space. Thanks for listening, and you can reach me out from there, and I'm happy to listen your questions now.
Hi, Gökçe. I hope you can hear us.
Yeah, I'm hearing now.
Yeah, I think that's a yes. We have time for one question. We're running a bit out of time. Is anyone in the room have a question? There.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions, but I might just email my second one to you. So you were talking about the algae biofuel. Are there studies that look at sort of how powerful it is compared to current use fuels? Or maybe you mentioned it and I missed it.
Yeah, it's actually, it's still in the study phase, but rather than power properties, it's more important, I think. It's not toxic and it's not dangerous, like it's not explosive in any minutes. And the carbon emissions are really low while production and usage. But the engines need to be redesigned according to those fuels. So we actually don't know how powerful and efficient it will be right now, because the engines of rockets and the other parts are specifically designed for that type of rocket fuel. And so now we have the technology to produce biofuel, and it's under test. But I think we cannot say like if it's more powerful or if it's more efficient in the long term. So it needs to be, I think, more researched and investigated more.
Great, thank you so much. I think if you have further questions, you can reach her on the email we've seen. We're going to move along and go. We've got a double presentation following of Hasin and Zahin and Asif, Hasan. They're doing Habitat 2.0 design approach towards a transplanetary multi-species settlement of coexistence. And I think they're tuning in from both the UK and Bangladesh, which is truly a hybrid conference we're having here. Right, I'm gonna put your sound on, and if you can share your screen, I hope you are able to.
Hello, everyone. This is Asif and I have my teammate Hasin Ahmad Zahin with me, and we're going to talk about Habitat 2.0. So this is basically a discussion about design approach towards a transplanetary multi-species settlement for coexistence. Before jumping into a detailed discussion, let's see what habitation actually is. So habitat is basically a study of area where a particular species or multiple species survive and they reproduce. And as we are living for thousands of years in this planet of 8.7 million species can be called Habitat 1.0. Interestingly, so far 0 species have been found or identified outside this planet. So whatever we're going to do outside the realm of planet Earth in terms of habitation should be called Habitat 2.0. Now, for beings that are individual, I think creating a habitat would be a very easy task. But for communal beings like human beings and many other species, we have to build a settlement first, and then we have to spread that settlement in order to create a habitation. So a habitation is, a settlement is basically a community. In terms of human beings, it can be a city, a town, a village, or other agglomeration of buildings where people live and work. Success of a settlement is a question that is synonymous to success of a habitat system. In habitat, we have survival and reproduction in order to succeed. And in terms of settlement, we are calling them sustainability and growth respectively. So in order for a settlement to be successful, it has to be sustainable and it has to inspire growth in a modular and in an overall scale as well. So if we look at settlements from earlier periods, we can see that it was always a balancing act between a planned structure and human perception. And this balancing act was balanced by the factors of context, resource, need, and capacity. If we analyze it more deeply, we'll see that this this act of balancing was an incremental and unstructured type of growth system, which can be seen in village and organic growth areas, and of course in cities when slums are being developed. To sum things up, here perception actually dominates over particular system or plan. So particular rigid geometry, particular rigid pattern, or a system is not visible in these conditions. But in last 100 years or so, population has increased, our limits, our resources are now limited, needs are competitive, and people are migrating rapidly to specific regions. So now, along with the old tasks, these challenges have merged, and we are now seeing cities that are being dominated by geometric patterns, and growth is being limited to vertical or volumetric systems. So what happens when the growth is restricted under geometry? We have seen a study where 2 researchers have gone or have performed a simulation that is called space metrics on a site ovary that is one company city, and we can see even though they were established as a very rigid modular geometry, the scope of organic growth doesn't go away from them, but it becomes restricted to its master plan in terms of overall growth. Now, this is where we stand in terms of civilization growth or settlement growth. But when we are leaping into Habitat 2.0, the question is, do we need to restrict ourselves in this type of growth pattern? Do we need to design geometrically in terms of shape, in terms of horizontal or vertical axis, or other questions? We can look at other species that are coexisting with us regarding this. These are also social beings. We have chosen bees and ants for this study because they have similar social structure as human beings. They perform individual tasks, and often they perform a community or total task as well. And they have their differences and alignment in terms of perception as well. So when they go and build their habitat, it is always driven by some sort of need, but they don't abandon the scope of organic growth even when they are practicing the system of modularity. We are calling these socially intelligent agents.
So what do we mean by socially intelligent agents? Socially intelligent agents are really the agents that not only observe what is happening to the surroundings, but also actively participate in the activities, and they identify themselves as individuals separate from the other species and maintain a relationship with them. It can be any sort of relationship. Some socially intelligent agents can be exemplified as humans, ants, and others. So what they necessarily do is they constantly read their environment and make sense of it. They interpret the perceived meaning of the environment and make decisions to act upon it, and then through these actions they adapt to the environmental changes. These adaptation or change to the responses are feedback. These can be observed as emergence in settlement pattern growth or behavioral pattern growth. So this can be observed in how ants interact in nature through other while scaling unscalable areas, like by creating bridges, or how termite mound changes their tunnels depending on the humidity and the wind flow pattern. So from this we can see that perception is very important for these agents to survive and thrive in any given condition. For this, we try to simulate from a single group's perspective by using Craig Reynolds Boyd's algorithm, which follows the flocking algorithm that has three basic behaviors like cohesion, separation, and alignment, through which they move around in a system, and they get they get attracted to any landmark attraction landmark point, or get repelled from any repellent landmark points. These behaviors have both strength and they have an effective field of radius which can be drawn parallel to a natural perception. The first few images shown shown how the agents cluster around two attractive focal points in the environment and stay away from the environmental environmental repel point. So this part is what was expected from the behavior, but from the as the simulation goes further, as we keep it running, one interesting behavior emerges. These two separate individual colonies try to connect with each other to coexist. So what was not in the script but emerged as a product of the agent's perception of their environment was creating a bridge between these two separate colonies, and this was done through an autonomous decision which is very similar to the ants in nature shown in the picture before. This perception for any a single living organism or single group is much more simpler than a multiple groups acting together or living together, because they have a lot of different other factors they need to consider for their group survival and coexistence. And for example, symbiotic species like termites and fungus garden, they exchange life sustaining resources with themselves, predator, like the fish swarms around and stay safe from the predators by creating a huge school. Through this, we try to explore what multiple groups in, if they have multiple landmark points or resource points associated in the environment, and how they would react. We try to explore that. So basically, it's almost the same, identical. It started off with the same flocking algorithm, but what essentially changes is that when afterwards, when they are grouped towards, they try to seek out neighbors. And based on the presence of neighbors or the number of the neighboring agents, they would try to grow vertically and proceed. So in the first few images here, we can show that how regions are self-organized depending on agents. The regions are created using gift wrapping algorithm or gram scan, because it takes the least amount of land area from any given point. And in the first two images, it shows that how the agents are distributed in respect to the landmarks, and how the self-organization actually changes the pattern of the regions. After that, to demonstrate the growth activity, we try to come up with a logical flow chart to demonstrate how it should be, how the script should behave. So first of all, it is considering if there are any neighboring region cluster, and if there are, they would grow away from each other by respecting the neighbor. And if the concentration is higher, there will be higher growth, same as different settlements.
So what we can learn from this? We can learn that the perception of a particular living organism is very important in terms of growth. And of course, the event of coexistence is much more complex, and additional factors should need to be considered. And the prospect of going simultaneously should always respect the phenomenon of individuality and respect the presence of others. But with all these considerations, we can say that the preconceived and imposed boundaries that we tend to impose on designs cannot always sponsor the growth that is desired from a living organism. Now, what happens if we actually impose a particular system on an organic system? There is no way to know in space context, because we haven't done that. But there was a project in earlier 90s which tried to explore the feasibility of space colonization through a system, and that is called BFfTH. So in this system, it was a preconceived design, and it had a master plan and space allocation for humans, space allocation for technical aspects, but everything in this system was expected to behave in a certain way, including the ecosystems that were artificially made. When people, real living people, were included in that system, some preconceived things actually worked. For example, their work distribution worked perfectly. The distribution of labor was functional. The agricultural success did not come in the first year, but in second year, they were having good harvest, and their metabolism increased. So there was some bio enhancement. And of course, there was a radical change in economy as carbon dioxide level was rising with time. But what was not expected was their perceptual environment declined radically. People were not feeling well. After 13 months, some were starving, some were suffocating, and they all thought they were going crazy. Overstocked fishes died. And of course, the level of carbon dioxide raised, but surprisingly, the oxygen level dropped from required 21% to 14.2%. And with the simulation, from that data, we can see that it was bound to happen, but not preconceived because no organic system or instant response was considered while designing this. And later, as an outcome, the project failed with 10% of oxygen being lost every single year. And it was labeled as a totalitarian hippie tachism atmosphere by many researchers. And of course, we can see there was a notion that it is a very technical project which was preconceived. There was a lack of respect for habitation perception, and of course, lack of any perceptual consideration that will need to be adjusted. So what we can see from this whole discussion is that the idea of designing something transplanetary would need to be established from an organic point of view and from the perception of the subjective inhabitants. And of course, when it comes to the question of coexistence, I think no preconceived challenge, preconceived design or a preconceived geometry should be imposed on the settlement pattern or design so that it can grow as a independent and thriving organism while they are out of planet Earth. So that's all from us. If you have any questions, you are welcome to ask. We'll be available to answer your questions.
Thank you.
Great. This was a really interesting presentation. I have lots of questions, but we don't have time for many. I don't want to impede on anyone's break. Is there a question here in the audience? No? Do we have on the chat? Okay, then I will ask you my one question, which is your simulation. I was wondering if when they were connecting, if they were creating different roles or if they're still acting the same, but they just extended their reach, because we see that in ants, for example, they have different roles when they're collaborating together. Do you see that in the simulation as well, or do they keep the same?
No, they don't alter their roles or anything in the simulation that we produced. It was basically doing the same thing over and over again. Because like it is just a basic simulation to explore, but maybe we can include that in the further explorations. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We're really looking forward to it. With this, I think we're closing a really successful sustainable habitats and travel session.